Session here at NUPI. My name is Morten Bøås. I am relatively new to NUPI. I took up a position here as a research professor at the 1st of September, so this is the first seminar that I attempt to host, and my thanks to Ingvild, who really helped and did all the hard work, because I really wouldn't know where to start, but now I'll pretend that I have not learned it, so I can ask you again, but I have probably learned a little bit. But anyway, thanks to everybody for coming, and particularly thanks to Daniel, who is from the Institute for Economics and Peace, who will be sharing his ideas and his concept around measuring positive peace and the post-2015 development agenda with us. Daniel has had a long career already. He has been a research associate to the Australian government. He has lived and worked and studied at the Beijing University, and holds various degrees from the Sydney University. And he's a research manager at the Institute for Economics and Peace, where these ideas around positive peace, about the pillars of peace, is one of, I guess, his main responsibilities. So anyway, we're going to do it like this, that Daniel will get the floor in just a second. He'll speak for around between sort of 25 minutes or so. And after that, I will give a few comments, and we will open it up to the floor, and we aim to end this in the time designated in the program, so that we have 1 hour for this. So I'm not going to waste more time, but please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks everyone for coming along. It's good to be here and good to be at NUPI. I couldn't come to Oslo and not visit NUPI, so really looking forward to talking about our research. I'm going to talk about two things today. One, the technical aspect of how we measure positive peace, this idea that people have talked about for a long time. And two, what the implications of that research is for the post-2015 agenda, and certainly the implications for a more ambitious post-2015 agenda. We have a pretty big opportunity in the next 2 years, and so I think these forums are really good to communicate and advocate for what we want in this post-2015 agenda. A little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace. We're a non-partisan, non-profit research institute. What we're really trying to do is strip peace of its utopian connotations. We're really trying to make it a practical, tangible thing that people can easily understand, that can be tracked over time, and that governments can actually positively influence. One of the main ways in which we do that is through our Global Peace Index, which is kind of like our main product, if you will. I can give you a little bit of an overview of that later. And really looking at the economic benefits of more peaceful societies. That's really our focus. So when we're talking about peace, it's really important to explain what we mean by it. And we've borrowed the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung's framework, negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of direct violence and the absence of the fear of violence. That's the definition that underpins the Global Peace Index. That involves many of the things that people commonly think of when they think of peace: the level of homicide, the level of violent crime, how much incarceration a country might have, the level of militarization and organized conflict. Pretty straightforward. But negative peace doesn't really tell you very much about the institutions and attitudes that you want to cultivate in order to make society more peaceful. And that's where positive peace comes into play. So that's really the focus of this presentation, and that's what we've tried to measure in our Positive Peace Index: the attitudes, institutions, and structures which, when strengthened, help make a society more peaceful, or at least help a society resolve its conflicts in a non-violent way. And I think I'll just start by highlighting the relationship that many researchers talk about, which is the link between conflict and development. The 2011 World Development Report was very clear about this. that essentially if you have conflict, if you have violence, it's very difficult to get a lot of the other development gains that people want. It's very difficult to get health and education when there's a war going on. And what this shows is the Global Peace Index, which is our measure of negative peace, so the violence of a society, correlated with the Millennium Development Goal Progress Index. So essentially, as you become more peaceful on the Global Peace Index, and closer to 1 is more peaceful, you tend on average to achieve more of your Millennium Development Goals. And we know from the Post-2015 agenda that that was indeed one of the key criticisms, that it didn't include conflict. And that's part of the reason why. It's because it's a really important facilitating factor for development more broadly. But that doesn't really tell us very much about what we need to cultivate and what we need to look at to create a more peaceful society. Violence is important to track, but once violence has happened, it's almost really too late. You've often destroyed a lot of the institutions that you've been trying to preserve, and that's why we want to look at positive peace. And the way in which we've tried to think about this is by developing a framework that we've called the Pillars of Peace. And our starting point was really to take the Global Peace Index, which is a very good measure of violence across 162 countries, and analyse that with many other cross-country data sets. So we've taken input and outcome indicators, indicators measuring formal and informal institutions, administrative data, survey data, so we've tried to get as much of that as possible. A lot of expert-based data, and increasingly these event databases, which are essentially media reports that have been coded, and really capturing macroeconomic measures of social well-being, integration, and the focus has been on a universal approach. So we're trying to cover as many countries as possible to look at, on average, what are the types of institutions that are associated with more peaceful countries? What can we learn about from those more peaceful countries? And this is the taxonomy that we've come up with to think about this. We have 8 pillars, things that are perhaps not that surprising, things like sound business environment, governance, the equitable distribution of resources. These are all important pillars that a country should have if it's going to be peaceful. And I should go through them. Acceptance of the rights of others is really about the informal institutions of a society, whether or not there's trust and tolerance and human rights in a country. Good relations with neighbours is really referring to whether or not there's good relations between neighbouring states, so the diplomatic relationships, the political and economic integration of the country. Free flow of information, human capital, and low levels of corruption are all important institutions, both formal and informal, linked to peacefulness. And what we're saying with this framework is that it's really a system. If you have a weakness in one of the pillars, then that will potentially undermine your other pillars. And we're not saying anything about causality. We're not saying that corruption leads to acceptance of the rights of others or vice versa. It very much depends on the context. So with that, I'm just going to move on and go through each of the pillars. And this is just a sample of some of the data sets, some of the other measures that basically correlate very strongly with the Global Peace Index. So what you can see here is really trying to capture the formal institutions of the state, whether or not there's good government effectiveness, whether the civil service actually delivers its services properly, whether or not there's rule of law, whether there's an effective judiciary and police force. Those are the kinds of institutions that we're trying to capture there. And I'll just go through some of the basic correlations. Something that we like to continue to emphasise is the link between functioning of government and governance type and peacefulness. It's just a fact that the countries that tend to be more democratic tend to be on average more peaceful. You can see at the The red dots are the authoritarian regimes, which tend to have the biggest spread. So there can be some authoritarian regimes that are relatively peaceful. Incidentally, if you're going to the top left, you're more peaceful and you have more governance or better government, or democracy, I should say. So that's just a really salutary point that we like to reaffirm. Then we look at sound business environment. This is really trying to look at the macroeconomic environment and both the formal and informal economic institutions that correlate with peace. So that's going right from the supporting infrastructure of the society, whether or not there's roads, access to water, electricity, these types of things, skills, but also the informal. So whether or not there's people feel positive towards entrepreneurship, for instance. And sound business environment really is one of those pillars that is both the product and producer of a more peaceful society. And just to segue briefly here, if we look at the cost of violence, it really is quite enormous. Earlier this year, we did a study on trying to count up all the expenditures related to dealing with and containing violence. And what we found is that it's about 11% of gross world product. So it's a huge amount of economic activity. That's money that's going to the military, to policing, to incarceration, to all the private sector expenditures on private security, for which now there's a very big industry globally. All the expenditures related to assault, medical costs, vandalism, this type of thing. And the key thing about those expenditures is that they're fundamentally unproductive. If you would allocate that money elsewhere, you could generate more economic activity. And so countries that are more peaceful tend on average to have less violence containment spending. And just to sort of drive this point home in the developed context, if we take the United States, and what we've done is build a peace index for the United States. We went back about 2 years ago and did this 15 years back. And the darker countries are states that are less peaceful. And what we see is that a really peaceful state like Maine spends about $280 per person on policing, incarceration, and general judicial functions. That's compared to Louisiana, which spends about $580. So they have this burden of violence, essentially, and that's costing taxpayers and it's costing business. On the private sector side, say if we take the market for alarm systems, and I've used Google searches as a proxy here, it's very difficult to find the size of alarm systems by state in the United States, but there's a correlation, and that might be good for the alarm system manufacturers, but it's not good for the rest of the broader economy. So this drives home a point that violence is something that is important to the rich countries as much as the poor ones. We're not just talking about the developing context. And I think this is also another interesting association. So what we find is that countries that are more peaceful tend to have less instability in terms of their prices and inflation. Sudden price shocks, we know, can be trigger factors for conflict, and that just creates a very difficult environment for the general business environment. Then if we look at equitable distribution of resources, that's really referring to not only the distribution of income, which is very important in wealthier context, but also the distribution of health and education. And those are some of the key correlations. We've also got the Youth Development Index, so how well a society distributes its resources to those that are 15 to 24, and that correlates. And this is just one sample. If we look at the Food Agricultural Organization's Land Inequality Index, we find that countries that have greater equality in land ownership have basically become more peaceful in the last, or have had smaller declines in peace in the last 6 years than those that have greater inequality in land ownership. It's not to say that land ownership is this silver bullet for a more peaceful society, but it's one factor of many other factors that's really quite important. And if we look at income inequality, and we just take this at the state level in the United States, states that have more peaceful environments also have greater income equality, and the same relationship holds for boroughs in, say, London. Acceptance of the rights of others. So we're really looking here at informal institutions, even though that says formal, it should say informal, and aggregating as much survey data as we can. And what we find with this is that countries that have greater inclusion of minorities, less discrimination, greater gender equality also tend to be more peaceful. And just to show some correlations here, if we look at gender inequality, for instance, the countries that provide reproductive health, better labour market outcomes for women, greater equality, will also tend to be more peaceful. There are some interesting exceptions, and I've highlighted just the in red there, some interesting exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, there's quite a strong correlation between that and violence. And similarly, if we look at the link between discrimination of refugees, minorities in society, that also correlates quite strongly, and I've highlighted the authoritarian regimes just as a guide. So good relations with neighbours, not particularly surprising that relations between neighbouring states, the diplomatic relations, also help determine the peacefulness of a society. I think what's more interesting about this is the fact that it's a continuum, that as countries gradually increase their regional and political integration, they on average become slightly more peaceful, or there is an association. Human capital, what we're trying to capture here is not only the stock of human capital, but how well it's utilised by society. And that's why we're looking at not only whether or not there's health or employment or education, but how satisfied people are with those services, how satisfied they are with their jobs, for instance. And these are all quite strongly correlated as well. And just to sort of show the link between education outcomes and peace, say in the United States, even in that very rich country, we see a link between the more peaceful states and the number of people who have completed high school. So I'm just going to quickly go through the next couple here, and this is free flow of information, which is looking at the freedom of the press, and it's measured by a group called Reporters Without Borders, which is put together by reporters. They report how free and independent the media environment is for them to report in, and that's quite strongly correlated with peacefulness as well, although I've pulled out the red countries, which are the authoritarian regimes, just to show that there are some interesting exceptions. It's not always the case that you get this linear thing. Sometimes you can have free, full and flawed democracies that don't do so well on this particular measure. And corruption. Corruption is a really important variable in terms of linking to peace. It's one that stands out quite often. This is the link between the Global Peace Index and the Corruption Perceptions Survey put together by Transparency International. What we see is that there's actually quite an interesting non-linear relationship. As countries improve on their corruption, they suddenly get quite a big improvement in peacefulness, and vice versa. So that's just one that is really quite important, and the relationship gets a lot stronger when you disaggregate the data and you look at police corruption and corruption in the judiciary. That's a really important part of determining a peaceful society. So what we did with all this data, and this is sort of getting to the nub of it, is we tried to put a measure on it, and we aggregated all these domains. So the 8 pillars become 8 domains in our positive peace index, and this has been empirically determined. So we've chosen the indicators, or the indicators have been chosen based on their statistical association with the Global Peace Index, with how peaceful or how violent a society actually is. And all the weightings are also statistically derived. And when we put all that data together, we get the Positive Peace Index, and this is just the data mapped. And a couple of observations to make about that. obviously, dark blue is more positive peace, and those are countries that essentially have greater resilience and greater institutional capacity. Those are the countries that can deal with external shocks better than the lighter shaded countries. The other thing to note is that there's quite a lot of grey on the map. We're missing about 36 countries at that national level, and this really draws attention to the lack of data. Even at that national level, it's really hard to measure the institutions of countries, and that's why the post-2015 agenda has made it so clear that we need this data revolution. We need to get better data because we don't even have a national average for some very important countries, let alone the really important subnational data. Because we don't know how well distributed all these things are between urban, rural, between different groups within society and between regions. The other thing I'd note about the positive peace data is that it moves very slowly. So if we look back 5 years ago, there's only about a 2% change in the actual total score. These institutions take a really long time to build up. And what I'm going to show here is just the link between your score or your rank on the positive peace index and your rank on the global peace index. And so on the bottom we have negative peace, and on the left we have positive peace. And naturally you would expect there's a correlation because they're partly derived from each other. But what we see is in the bottom left, the Western European countries, mostly upper income countries, mostly democratic, although there are some exceptions like Singapore, for instance, which is not fully democratic or not classified as fully democratic. And those countries, relatively speaking, have institutional capacity and have low levels of violence. Up the top right, in the red, are really the countries that I would say are in a vicious cycle of either conflict and low institutional capacity. Those are the countries that it's really hard to move out of that zone once you're in it. And then really the most interesting area of the chart is probably in the middle and above the red line. Those are the ones sort of kind of going up to the top, which have relatively low positive peace and quite relatively high negative peace. The countries like Laos and Sierra Leone are really interesting outliers. Those are countries that we would describe as positive peace deficit countries. They lack institutional capacity given their levels of violence. And what we would expect is over time, they would tend back towards the red line. And what we did with this data is track it back 6 years, which is as far back as we can go with this given set of data. And we get this diagram, which shows basically the movement in positive peace and negative peace. And the long red lines show basically big deteriorations in negative peace, so countries becoming much more violent. And the really big fallers, quite interestingly, are those that were positive peace deficit countries. So the ones that in 2008 that we would have looked at and said these have a deficit in positive peace would have been Syria, Rwanda, Madagascar and Egypt, all countries which have since then in the last 6 years have had different types of conflict but had significant conflict nonetheless. And there are some exceptions, of course. I mean, some countries haven't, and that's where a lot more of the research needs to be done about trigger factors and about how these things actually interact. So I'm just going to show a couple of slides to further emphasize why we need to measure institutions. And this is just two data sets that people commonly use to measure and track fragility and progress of countries in terms of moving away from conflict. On the left is the State Fragility Index, which is a database that a lot of academics use and researchers use to track fragility. If we look at the Arab Spring countries, in the last 15 to 20 years, that data suggests that those countries have been becoming less fragile, they're becoming more stable. Similarly, if we look at the Human Development Index, there's been some quite amazing gains in human development, all telling a pretty positive story about development in the Arab Spring countries. Similarly, if we look at economic growth, they've all had and I've just chosen 4 select countries here, in the last 10 years they've all had pretty strong economic growth. But if we go to the Positive Peace Index measures and we try and take them back to 1996, we see a slightly different story. Algeria, which we know is a country that did not experience significant violence, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but going down is actually an improvement in positive peace. The lower you score, the better. But it's a different story for Syria and Yemen. If we track that data back, it's sort of showing that they were declining in positive peace. And in the case of Egypt, it was just becoming very unstable with a slight deterioration. So for us, this just emphasizes the point that you need to be tracking these institutions and trying to, I guess, improve them and build capacity before you get to a conflict. And just as a practical demonstration of this, if we take the Positive Peace Index scores and look at overseas development assistance, there basically isn't any correlation between the way these countries score on their institutions, on their long-term institutional capacity, and the amount of overseas development assistance they're getting. Obviously, there's many other actors now. We have private foundations and business providing funds, but certainly the ODAs themselves, there is not really a strong correlation. So look, I'm just going to finish it there because I'm conscious of the time, Martin, and I know we want to probably get to questions. But I would just sort of finish with three key points. One, we'd say violence is still the first order priority to track and measure. The post-2015 agenda still needs to confirm that it's going to track conflict and insecurity. We still need to have that in there, absolutely. I think the trend in violence from armed conflict towards interpersonal and criminal violence is really important. And I think today the majority of violent deaths are homicides still. It's not armed conflict, and we need to remember that. And I think these types of institutions are much more important in explaining that kind of violence. So I think the importance of measuring these things and tracking them will only actually increase. Finally, I'd just say that violence is a continuum. What the GPI shows is it's not just a transition from peace to conflict. There's many shades of grey in between, and that's why we need to have the goals being universal, and that's why I think violence is certainly something that the rich countries, the high-income countries, need to have and track as well. So I'll leave it there, and maybe we can get to questions, Martin.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and I think we should give him a round of applause. This was very, very interesting, and obviously, I mean, you and your institute has really done some groundbreaking work in trying to sort of put some new light on this, and particularly sort of your emphasis on positive peace, which is. It's interesting, it's needed, but it's of course also very, very challenging, because I mean one thing is to talk about peace as the absence of war and try to calculate the number of war-related deaths and secondary and tertiary effects of war and conflict and so on, which is difficult enough. I mean, just to look at the huge debate concerning war-related casualties in the Congo, where the number of casualties are quite highly contested between various data sets and various researchers, but this is even more difficult in many ways and challenging. And but I mean that should not stop us from trying to do this. So I mean, let me first start by sort of congratulating you on the work that you have done, and then I would like just to open up the Q&A session by just asking you a couple of questions and comments. One of them relates to this issue of, I mean, the role of institutions, which I think, we all agree that sort of institution building is, of course, a necessity for building a stable and peaceful society. But there is also something and some certain. I'm just trying to figure out how we try to deal with the kind of countries which are in these middle positions, where they are still volatile. They have societies which are highly fragmented and divided. And in some of these situations, in fact, sort of the attempt to build strong institutions that lack the kind of legitimacy and transparency can in fact really turn these countries into from places of volatility to in fact open warfare. Cote d'Ivoire in between sort of 2008 and 2010 is probably an example of that, where a particular sort of Gbagbo's attempt to strengthen his position by building a strong bureau for the election and the electoral code, and not the least the handing out of voter registration cards, immensely contributed to the conflict. And there are also a couple of other countries where we see that kind of, where institutions building in fact has a negative impact. So I just wonder how you try to deal with to separate out these kind of issues. I guess my question is sort of how do you sort of move between what is general and what is extremely context specific? My second comment in that regard has to do with, I mean, you mentioned the issue of corruption and corruption and peace. I mean, I don't think that any of us would argue that there is anything good about corruption, but on the other hand, it may be that there is something that is missing here, and that's sort of an intervening variable called trust. For instance, if you look at the trajectory of Ghana and South Korea, there is really nothing that suggests that South Korea was less corrupt than Ghana. But there is one major difference in what happened with the resources that was skimmed away through corruption. In Ghana, that these money were either spent on luxury consumption, spent on patronage practices, or sent abroad. In South Korea, the majority of these funding seems to have been plowed back into the economy in relatively productive investments. Why was that the case? Why did the South Korean business elite and political elite, military elite, behave so differently than the Ghanaian elite? Maybe it's an issue of basic trust, where in fact, I mean, the South Korean elite, they trusted their own society. Even if they were all aware of the corrupt practices, they sort of took a long-term perspective on this, whereas the Ghanaian elite took a very sort of short-term perspective. So maybe there is something here that we can discuss. My third comment is really about the use of existing data sets, and of course we can turn this into a immensely technical discussions, which I think we should not. But maybe you could sort of clarify a little bit. I mean, how you try to use these data sets in comparison, because I'm not necessarily saying that you're comparing apples and monkeys, but at least there are different issues concerning both how things are measured in between these data sets that you use, and also certain questions that can be raised around some of the data quality in some of these data sets. And for instance, I would here refer to Morten Jerven's recent work on the data quality of World Bank data, where basically he has been able to show in his latest book how data that nobody would trust because it has the stamp, for instance, of the Sierra Leonean Bureau of Statistics, suddenly becomes foolproof data when they have the World Bank stamp on them. The data is precisely the same. There is nothing that has happened to these data. They have not been rechecked, recollected, or anything. They have just been turned around from being a product of the Sierra Leonean statistics to becoming a product of the World Bank, and therefore is seen as foolproof, which obviously is not the case. I think I'll stop there. Maybe if you can just take, I'm not giving you too much time to answer this, so a couple of minutes and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah, look, a lot of questions there, man.
I know.
Yeah, to the first sort of question, I think, and it links to the third part. We first want to understand which countries actually are volatile, and that's where there's this empirical challenge. And I was going to say this in the answer to the third question is that we really need to collect better data. And so people are talking now about say DHS surveys, which pretty much are the gold standard for data collection. If we take, say, those surveys, they cost about $2 million a country. They can ask incredibly detailed questions around interpersonal violence, amongst other things, about perceptions of trust and safety and all these things, faith in institutions. And they've been relatively uncontroversial. If we did that for the whole world, $2 million per country, 150 odd countries, it's about $300 million a year. It's still a very small portion of total ODAs. So I think there's an empirical challenge there that needs to be tackled. In terms of the extent to which these quantitative efforts can tell you everything about, say, the difference between Ghana and Sierra Leone, there are limits, obviously, and a lot of those limits are to do with the quality of the data, no doubt. But the quantitative efforts will only get you so far. This really needs to be complemented by country-specific studies, and that's why we're saying, when we show that Pillars of Peace framework, is that the causality, the way these factors relate to each other, are going to vary in each country and each region, and it's very complex. That's why the emphasis is on this systems theory approach, which is just to try and map and chart, okay, where are there really big deficits, and then start from there. But point taken, I mean, it's going to be very difficult. In terms of the corruption question, people, when they say corruption, they tend to think of it as being this one amorphous thing. I mean, there's many different types of corruption. There's venal corruption, there's corruption in the judiciary, there's that elite corruption that you're talking about. And I think in trying to, there are often exogenous factors. So it just so happens that South Korea got some more enlightened leadership, perhaps, that Ghana didn't get. Sometimes there might not be systematic explanations for these things, and so there is an element of, I think, we don't know what we don't know, and we can't necessarily predict those exogenous type of factors. And just to the data quality question, I mean, look, it is a really big issue. I mean, just take homicide, for instance. Homicide data is quite unreliable, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as you would probably know. And we can see quite large variations year to year. So there needs to be a lot of effort done just to get better data on something as elementary as that. Sierra Leone, when I think about it, I mean, we can take a very good example is youth unemployment data. You can look at Sierra Leone, and if you look at the country stats, they have one of the best youth unemployment rates in the world at about 7%. If you go to the African Development Bank, they say it's about 36%, which puts them around about the middle. And then if you go to a couple of NGOs which generate this data through household surveys, they say it's about 70%, which pretty much makes them the worst in the world. So there's huge challenges there that really, I don't know how we overcome them unless we just collect better data.
Yes, and of course, when you take sort of the unemployment figures of both not only Sierra Leone but also Liberia, I mean, whether it is 7, 36 or 70, I mean, none of them really make any sense. I mean, 7 is, at least when it comes to formal employment, completely exaggerated the other way. On the other hand, I mean, 70% of the population is obviously not, they're not unemployed, because if they were unemployed as not working, I mean, these people would be starving to death, because there is no social security system here who picks them up, so they're doing something. So it is an immensely difficult category to operate with in these kinds of environments, and maybe we just need to find a new way of defining it. And similar when it comes to homicide, I think that one way which you pointed at in African countries, I mean, one of the main problems, particularly in countries who recently have experienced war and crisis, that after a war, I mean, war-related deaths are drawn into a post-war homicide statistics, which really, I mean, can make up for either having sometimes overblown or sometimes too low figures. Again, it's immensely difficult because I mean you're asking people also using not only statistics but perception data on this. But thanks for very good answers, and please, the floor is open.
Yeah, I would like to.
Introduce
My name is Garvey. I'm a part-time researcher here at NUPI. I would like to. I think there is an underlying assumption here that all good things tend to go together, and I tend to question that assumption. And let me go to one particular case which I think is very important to study in this context, and that is the Arab Spring. I think your data basically went up to 2010, and of course that doesn't really grasp what has happened after that. One of the correlations I could see here was between the reduction in authoritarianism and the increase in peace. And I think the Arab Spring proves exactly the contrary. That is only one example, of course, but I think today when governments in transition are looking for ideals, and I'm working particularly on Cuba, to look around in the world today, it doesn't really seem that the reduction of authoritarianism is a good path if you want to maintain peace or increase peace. So I think that's only one example. But can you address the issue of really? Do you believe that there is a general trend that all good things go together?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I think there's going to be exceptions, and I think generally speaking, yes. Generally speaking, but I think there will be exceptions. I think in terms of the Arab Spring, I mean, there have been some of the transitions have been relatively more peaceful than others. Some have been incredibly violent. I think there's an interplay of other institutions going on here. You could argue that Myanmar is in the middle of a peaceful transition from authoritarian to a hybrid regime to a flawed democracy. So I think it will depend. But yeah, granted, so we're not going to definitely say, well, okay, you're authoritarian, you need to become a full democracy overnight. I think the other thing that this emphasizes is that this takes a very long time to transition. And we've seen that in Afghanistan. I think, the optimism of a lot of peace building and state building community is that you can change these institutions really quickly. And I think when you look at the rate of progress, it's just very difficult. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's certainly one to think about.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah.
What do you think is the signal sent by what happens to the Arab Spring? I mean, apart from Tunisia, I can't see very many successful cases. So what is the signal by being sent by the Arab Spring?
The signal?
In terms of reduction of authoritarianism being a good stage on the road towards peace and democracy and well-being and whatever.
Yeah, I think I think as the it's very difficult because we're talking about the link between comparing governance types across the world, and on average, full democracies or countries with democratic institutions will tend to resolve their conflicts non-violently. As that democratic infrastructure, if you will, gets built up, and when the informal institutions start to build up, when people start to understand and accept and trust democratic institutions, there's a forum there to resolve these conflicts in a non-violent way. So I think that's the normative implication of that, of having that pillar in our Pillars of Peace framework, is that we're certainly coming from that point, that sort of starting point, that if, and it's an assumption, if you are democratic, then you will resolve conflicts. You're more likely to resolve conflicts in a non-violent manner. And I think it's, with the Arab Spring, there's something very specific about the level of economic development that a country gets to and its lack of democracy. And I think that's one thing that's interesting about the economic growth charts, is that the growth has been quite incredible in a lot of these places for a long time. People have got basic education, basic health, and now they're asking for something more. And that's where I think the democracy comes into play.
Anybody else who has some issues they would like? Yes, please.
I'm Marius Walter from the UNDP Oslo Governance Center. We are heavily involved in the post-2015 frameworks on measurements on governance, principally. And I wanted to, the title of the presentation was related to post-2015, so I think we should also think of it from that angle and maybe discuss a bit. What I wanted to, your graph on ODI relationship, like increasing ODA and then also looking at the positive piece, there was no correlation. And the same applies actually looking at the Arabic Spring, the Kaufman article, I don't know if it's the recent one, but also has like proofs that you have increasing ODA in these countries, but on the other side, the voice and accountability goes down. So that opens a bit the floor to think about the strategy of development interventions and how do we invest in these scenarios as well, and what are we supporting, and on which data are we looking. From my perspective, there is a lot of data out there, and we discussed about quality and about all that. But on the other hand, we need to think about, are we looking at the right data on the right indicators? Are we listening to the right people, and are we aligning our interventions to the right or designing them on the right way to target the right issues? I think that's it. And then looking at post-2015 now, if you've read the high-level panel report, there are two goals now related to governance and peace, and these two goals are kind of separated at the moment. One is for governance and responsive institutions, and the other one on peace, building peaceful nations and societies. So now we need to see how the discussion goes in the next month, and there's a high risk that these two goals may collapse, because we had discussions in New York in June and last week as well on how we measure these goals, and in both meetings it turned out that these things are so correlated with each other, it's difficult to separate it, kind of. So this is one scenario which could happen, and maybe that's my question, is like, what's your perception now looking at the data, looking on all this, the positive peace concept, which brings in so many dimensions of peace, where human rights, where governance is included in your concept as well. So I think there might be no way maybe to separate those two, and that this will collapse most likely. Just as a comment, and maybe to discuss more on that.
Cool, thanks, Marius. I think in terms of the ODA and the timing of development assistance, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there was another graph I was going to show, which was the change in ODAs and the change in peacefulness. And of course, one of the dilemmas of timing ODAs is just how long it takes. I mean, a lot of these things are multi-year projects that takes a lot of planning, and in that time countries can go down in terms of their voice and accountability, or go up dramatically. So you're always going to have these timing issues. I think the key challenge for ODAs is addressing that tension between the short-term humanitarian assistance and the long-term capacity building. And I think when you look at this change chart I was going to show, there's been many countries, probably about 35, 40 countries in the last 6 years that have had big declines in peacefulness, big declines in big increases in violence, and more than 100% reductions in their ODAs. That might be what you want, but that provides an additional shock to a lot of these already fragile places. So as a monitoring and evaluation effort, I think without knowing the total details, I think this is something that, on the face of it, can be improved. I think when you look at governance and peace in the post-2015 agenda, the thing that I've been really, interested to hear people say in a lot of these consultations that are now happening all over the world, and there's hundreds of reports now from various organisations, not dissimilar to the one that I work at, where people are advocating for X and Y and Z and B and A, is that I think we don't want to preempt the political process. I think we want to show the evidence that's out there as much as possible, and leave the political process up to the politicians, up to the member states. I think that's really out of the control of civil society, in a sense. That what civil society can do now is provide the evidence, show that these things can be measured, show that it's possible, and support advocacy where it's necessary. But I think, peace and governance, there are some tricky measurement issues. And I think you can overcome a lot of those by having the goals universal. If they're goals that all the countries aspire to, then I think that actually does take that surely takes a lot of the political tensions out of this being an exercise of naming and shaming all the low-income South countries that people like to talk about.
If I may add to that, of course, these kind of, whether we are talking about your positive peace index or we are talking about other types of indexes, they may be quite good at, they give you based on the data, they give you an overview of how things look like. And every now and then it turns up something interesting that one hadn't thought of. And that's a value in itself. They can also be, to a certain extent, used to monitor some sort of progress. But for this to be useful, also when it comes to ODI, for some sort of, whether it is developmental interventions or other kinds of interventions, you also need some sort of you need a partner that you can work with, and to that extent I think that some of these ideas that has been coming out of this alternative G7, which are sort of the fragile state G7, is this idea about some sort of self-monitoring, where the whole point of the process is not necessarily a naming and shaming exercise, which I'm not saying that you in any way are part of, or I am part of, but which it easily can become, as these kind of lists and indexes also become part of the public debate. And what then most often happen is that the people that you would like to try to address, like to try to get some sort of process with, they dig themselves down into trenches and are happily throwing oral grenades out of that trenches, and it doesn't really takes us anywhere. But maybe if one can turn this into more, that the whole point is more about monitoring self-progress, or the other way around, then it could be also more useful as some sort of tool in which governments and donor partners can use this for some purposes, but one also needs to keep in mind that it never tells us anything. And I'm also glad that Daniel highlighted this, that this can take us so far, but there are certain things that statistics in themselves and alone never can tell us. And one of the immensely tricky thing when it comes is this between governance and peace is, of course, that what kind of societies are we talking about here? More often than not, we're talking about societies which are immensely fragmented, vertically fragmented. And how do you build institutions within those kind of societies? Well, either you actually have a decaying process that can last for almost ever. Somalia may be an example of that. That said, if the Somali economy was measured properly, Somalia would probably be a middle-income country in African terms. It's not the poorest country in Africa. Far from it. And they're also doing quite well if you measure things like information on freedom based on the number of satellite dishes, universities, newspapers, particularly electronic and so on. But that's another part of the story. But in these kind of situations where societies are so vertically fragmented, it also means that people's sort of main concern are sort of that small core group that they belong to, and building bridges between these. I mean, we have tried in the past through various interventions in a lot of different places like this, and if there's one thing we can say about sort of the last 20 years of these kind of intervention, is basically that they have not been very successful. I mean, I think we also need to get to the level that we have more soberness, both with regard to what our data actually can tell, and that is a responsibility for all those researchers working on this, that we should take pride in talking about what our data can show, but we should also have the, how should one say, the decency of always pointing out the limitations of data. And I think that you did that, Daniel. I think that's good. And likewise, we should be always communicate to the kind of policymakers that we are presenting this to, that no matter how long you look at these data, I mean, the basic thing sort of still is the same, and that the only people who can make peace in a certain country, put it on a more peaceful trajectory that is sustainable, are those that live there. There is no sort of alternative to that. No matter how smart our developmental interventions becomes, no matter how much money we put into a more international intervention. I mean, if the conditions are not there for making peace, if the conditions are not there either, that people have come to the conclusion that war will not take us anywhere further, or that was more or less the case of Mozambique when Frelimo and Renamo made peace with each other, or if somebody has emerged as some sort of hegemonic structure. When countries are that divided, there is not that much we can do about it. I know that that is not necessarily what we would like to hear, but I think that we need to get back to that level of soberness when it comes to what we can achieve, both with data as well as with various interventions. Let's see, we still have a couple of comments before I have to give Daniel the last and final words. So anybody else who would like to jump in with a short comment? Okay, Daniel, you get the last words here.
Okay. No, thanks, Man. I appreciate your comments, and I just guess I would like to say thanks everyone for coming along. It's really good to share our research, and one thing I'd emphasize is that for people who are researchers here, we're more than happy to share our data and follow up. I would love to see country-specific case studies using some of the data that we've generated, and I think this is really, in many ways, a start of a process rather than the end. So, yes, I'd just like to say thanks, and thanks, Martin.
Thank you. Should be on time. And thanks everybody for coming.
Cheers. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.